I'm Wendy Martin, Director of the Transdisciplinary Studies program at the Claremont Graduate University. Today we're going to have a very interesting lecture. I know all of you have been looking forward to this. I had no idea that the topic of vampires was so fascinating to so many. I don't know that much about it. I am learning a lot. I am starting to read Gothicka, Victoria Nelson's most recent book, the subtitle being Vampire Heroes, Human Gods, and the New Supernatural, published by Harvard University Press in 2012. Victoria Nelson has published several other books. I'm going to give you the titles of those publications, and she's always worked on topics that have been, I think, quite unusual, original, ahead of their time, very provocative, imaginative, and bold, and I've always admired her for this. Her book before Gothicka is Wild California, published in 2004. Before that, The Secret Life of Puppets, published again by Harvard University Press in 2002. And then My Time in Hawaii, a Polynesian memoir published by St. Martin's Press in 1989. She's also published a lot of fiction. I will talk a little bit about that, and a book on writer's block, which I found very helpful many times over. Gothicka is her critical study in the Gothic genre in 20th century fiction and film. It is a companion volume to The Secret Life of Puppets, and traces strands of alternate spirituality in the fictional realm of vampires, space aliens, and other supernatural entities. Victoria Nelson has also written several screenplays and adapted her script of Balzac's mystic novel, Seraphita, as a theater piece with staging designed in a collaboration with Mabou Mine's puppet master, Jane Catherine Shaw. Her lecture today is Stephenie Meyer and the 21st Century Vampire Romance. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Victoria Nelson.
Thank you, Wendy. And I'll just tell you folks that your professor and I were undergrads at Berkeley together sometime before the last ice age. So it's a particular pleasure to be here today in her class. I just would say, and to start out, that these two books, The Secret Life of Puppets and Gothicka, grew out of a curiosity that I had about the supernatural in Western culture, and why was it that we had it was all bad, it was all horror and monsters and scary creatures. There wasn't really a nice supernatural until possibly the 1990s, when fantasy began to move into the mainstream, and a lot of other formerly marginal pop culture genres came out of the sort of B-movie pulp fiction ghetto and really began mainstreaming in our culture. And so Gothicka in particular grows out of this. I was interested in the Gothic, which is, as you may or may not know, the original 18th century English literary shock genre that was full of sex, sadism, bad nuns and priests, nostalgic medievalism, and anything else you might imagine, and really kind of swept England for a while. But before I get into that, I just want to call your attention to my little epigram for this lecture, which is also, in a funny way, a kind of epitaph. It's by Emily Dickinson, your professor's great field of expertise, and perhaps, Wendy, you can tell us, I took this little stanza to be about the afterlife, but apparently there are some scholars who don't think that's what it's about. So what's your call on this?
Well, I won't use the whole lecture in itself, but I can say you can read it that way for the purpose of this lecture.
Terrific. We'll take it as the afterlife and go from there. So as I was saying, the Gothic started out as this really lowbrow, salacious, full of sex and violence genre. The first Gothic novel is generally considered to be Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto. It came out in 1764. Immediately spawned all kinds of imitations. People wanted to write about the Middle Ages, the Gothic period. They were fascinated with it because they could sort of talk about supernatural things. They could look at Roman Catholicism as being sort of bad and good at the same time, and all kinds of other things. But what happened to the Gothic was very interesting, because as it grew as a genre into the 1790s, we have Anne Radcliffe, the sort of best-known Gothic writer, Mysteries of Udolpho and others, and then Matthew Lewis, who wrote the sensational Monk. What happened to the Gothic was that after its classic period, which is kind of between mid-18th century and 1820, it then morphed into all kinds of other subgenres that flourished right through the 19th and 20th century into our century. So it's actually a 250-year-old literary movement that far outlasted its more highbrow sibling, the Romantic movement. So today, in the 21st century, the Gothic's huge array of subgenres, from novels and graphic novels to films and video games, are saturated with supernaturalism. The supernatural is no longer promoted as an evil and imaginary dimension ruled by the devil or other dark forces and located outside ordinary human existence, but rather, in the words of Alan Ball, the creator of the HBO vampire series True Blood, as deep nature, integral to our daily lives in the way it was, or at least the way we believe it was, in pre-modern Europe. The 21st century Gothic imaginary has drawn on doctrines associated with a venerable strand of alternative American religion that is this country's heritage from the Radical Reformation, carried by groups that reached our shores in the 17th century and by their spiritual descendants here, from the Shakers and Perfectionists to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Christian Science, Theosophy, Scientology, and the Nation of Islam. These groups have in common the doctrine of theosis, the possibility of experiencing divinity while still embodied in human form. Foremost among the 21st century Gothic subgenres drawing in a new wave from these esoteric traditions is the vampire narrative, which first appeared in the classic English literary Gothic in 1819 with John Polidori's The Vampire. Now, I'll just say as a note that the vampire folklore does not come from Eastern Europe. It actually comes from the South Slavic regions and Greece. But for various complex reasons, the news and stories of it filtered through the Austro-Hungarian Empire into the newspapers of Western Europe. And people would read these vampire stories, news reports in Paris and London, and they would just be electrified. Vampires didn't enter Western European consciousness until that time. And my hunch is really that this was exactly the time that the witchcraft laws were being repealed in England and all across Western Europe. And it left a kind of supernatural vacuum, and particularly the kind of dark shadow of Christianity, where you had the witches' Black Sabbath, which was a sort of parody of Christianity. Now you had these vampires who seemed to be aping a sort of strange, blasphemous parody of the blood sacrament. So they sort of fit right very neatly into the hole that was left by the witches. Now, The Vampire is a work that grew indirectly out of that infamous summer of 1816 at the Villa Diodati in near Geneva, where there was this famous storytelling wager proposed by Byron that produced Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a fragment of a vampire story from Byron that he later incorporated into a longer poem, and a long novel by Polidori that everyone has forgotten. But at that time, Polidori was only 25 years old, and he was Byron's personal physician, and he hero-worshipped Byron. But later he became disillusioned. He quit. He quit Byron's employ, and he sat down and he wrote this little story about a decadent English aristocrat in Greece, which of course was Byron's stamping grounds, who becomes a vampire in Greece, and then he marries young women and he kills them on their wedding night for their blood. And in writing this story, Polidori took this folk tradition, which really had some peasant rising out of his grave and going and feeding on his family, and he introduced the idea of this aristocratic villain and the sort of sexual element of preying on young women. And this was a convention or a template that really ruled for the rest of that century. Polidori's story was wildly popular, and it was quickly translated to the stage in France, and then in England, and then all across North America. For all of the 19th century, there were these vampire melodramas. It was a very vital theatrical form that introduced this character and this convention to a very wide audience. So then other vampire stories began to emerge in the English tradition, and by 1872 you have Sheridan Le Fanu's homoerotic female vampire Carmilla, and various others. But all of these were put into shadow, of course, in 1897 with Bram Stoker's Dracula. Dracula was not immediately successful as a novel, and once again it went through various stage adaptations that really made the story much more widely known, and it was a stage adaptation of Dracula that was adapted to the 1931 Todd Browning movie with Bela Lugosi. And of course, this became Bela Lugosi. He's still the aristocratic vampire feeding on women, became the new template for vampires really right through the 20th century. Now, please understand, I'm really compressing this history here. I just do not have time in this talk to go into all the various kind of subgenres and tributaries, but this is kind of the mainstream. Dracula became and was the sort of dominant vampire figure until 1976, when the next big innovation was Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire. And this was really one of the most significant turning points in the vampire narrative, because Rice let her vampire tell his story in the first person, thereby subtly shifting this character from object to subject, antagonist to protagonist, still evil, but also someone a reader could identify with. She got her vampires out from under the Catholic Christian framework that the Protestant Stoker had bestowed on them, and then upgraded her vampires from undead to immortal, which was a very significant reframing. In later novels of her vampire chronicles, she even gave them a divine genealogy direct from the Egyptian gods Isis and Osiris. Writers after her, such as Chelsea Quinn Yarborough and Laurel K. Hamilton, made their vampires able to engage in sex with humans and feed on humans without killing them, which was another big sort of shift in the genre. So slowly, over a period of 30 years after Rice, vampires came out of the shadows, and by the year 2008 and the HBO series True Blood, they had become yet another minority agitating for its rights in the new multicultural millennium. By the time Stephenie Meyer began publishing her Twilight series of novels in 2005, the big question was whether the vampire mythos had anywhere to go, and the answer, of course, was that it did. Where her predecessor contemporaries made and continue to make typically late 20th century choices in constructing their evil vampire narratives, Meyer directly taps into the new Gothic sensibility of the 21st century that blends the monstrous with the divine rather than the demonic. Over 4 novels, Meyer tells the story of 16-year-old Bella, a self-described klutz who in the time-honored women's Gothic romance tradition of Charlotte Bronte's demure heroine Jane Eyre, favors sweats over designer fashions. Despite her low opinion of herself, Bella attracts boys at her new high school, particularly the wealthy, devastatingly handsome Edward Cullen, of whom she says, "It was hard to believe someone so beautiful could be real." As it turns out, he isn't, as in real human. Edward is a vampire frozen in his 17-year-old human body for almost a century since his death during the 1918 influenza epidemic. Edward's family is in fact a coven run by Patriarch Carlisle, an ethical vampire who has forsworn feeding on humans for the less tasty blood of animals, which he and his cohort discreetly seek out at regular intervals in national parks. Meyer follows the old-time Gothic women's romance formula laid down by Bronte, that is, of a bourgeois young woman of humble means encountering a family of wealthy, mysterious aristocrats. The Cullen family is much higher up on the social ladder than Bella's. The parents, Carlisle and Esme, are not only more mature, sophisticated, and attractive, they are also far more emotionally supportive of Bella than her own human mother and father. Their light, airy McMansion, located on an estate outside of town, is the striking reverse of Dracula's decrepit castle, and they don't sleep in coffins in the basement. A huge wooden cross carved by Carlisle in his pre-vampire days when he was a minister in 17th century England hangs in the living room. And is the case with almost all Gothic vampires. They are capitalists with a capital C. Interest compounded over the centuries keeps the Cullens staggeringly wealthy. And I just would note in a footnote that this is a trope taken up from the pre-modern story of the wandering Jew, the person who reviled Jesus and is condemned never to die, and he wanders the world, but somehow, because of investing, he ends up being quite wealthy. So the love affair that begins between Edward and Bella is unusual on a number of counts. Most obviously, Edward must keep his bloodlust for her constantly in check. His urge to feed and kill humans is, in effect, Edward's version of original sin, a flawed state the ethical vampire inherits and must constantly struggle against to remain righteous. Just as with humans, some of Meyer's vampires succeed in being moral and some do not. Moreover, Edward is physically so strong, he insists they can't have sex because he might accidentally hurt her, or worse, give in to his vampire instincts in the height of passion and begin feeding. As a result, Bella and Edward enjoy endless foreplay, a situation that goes a long way towards explaining this series' enormous popularity with young girls and also their mothers. Bella rights the lopsided balance of power with Edward by means of a startling decision. Against his violent objection, she wants to become a vampire too. Why? Because it will give her the same status Jane Eyre insisted on having with Edward Rochester. Parity in the relationship. A man and a woman have to be somewhat equal, Bella tells Edward, as in one of them can't always be swooping in and saving the other one. They have to be saving each other equally. I can't always be Lois Lane. I want to be Superman too. By the end of the third novel, however, the story seems destined to hit a literal dead end. For hundreds of pages, Bella and Edward have been frozen in their standoff, whose creepy but inexorable resolution must be Bella's death and transformation into a kind of monster god in exchange for sexual consummation and eternal love. Though Bella is fiercely looking forward to it, we readers can't help feeling apprehensive about this choice for a young girl. But in Breaking Dawn, the last volume of the series, it really does happen. To bring this transformation about, Meyer weaves a tapestry of bright threads from folk tales, religious apocrypha, and esoteric traditions of Western cultures. The first of these threads is the oldest. Bella is, bluntly speaking, the bride of death. She's in love, after all, with an already dead being whose deepest instinct is to kill her, and she agrees to enter his underworld by her voluntary decision to die to join him. The presence of another ancient trope in the Twilight series helps underscore Bella's role as the bride of death. It appears in the two striking physical qualities Meyer's vampires possess. First, in daylight, they don't turn to dust. Rather, their skin sparkles beautifully. Quote, like thousands of tiny diamonds were embedded in the surface. The sparkling body has immediate associations with the diamond or rainbow body of Tibetan Buddhism, the normally invisible sheath surrounding the physical body that connects consciousness to the transcendent realm where matter transforms to pure light. After death, the diamond body, like the Christian resurrection body or the Gnostic radiant astral body, promises immortality. The fact that the vampires' diamond bodies are visible to the naked eye in daylight strongly suggests they belong to some category of the divine or ascended human rather than the demonic. They have reached the highest state of human development on earth, in which, in the words of a contemporary theosophist, quote, enlightenment becomes a literal fact through the transubstantiation of flesh and blood into an immortal body of light. As for the second physical characteristic, building on a convention established by Rice, Meyer's vampires look and feel like statues. Edward's chiseled beauty does not recall the sinister figures of Dracula or Lestat, but rather the classic outlines of a Renaissance statue, quote, carved in some unknown stone, smooth like marble, glittering like crystal. Bella says cuddling with Edward feels like, quote, snuggling with Michelangelo's David, except that this perfect marble creature wrapped his arms around me to pull me closer. The motif of loving a statue has been around since Ovid's story of Pygmalion and his stone bride, picked up in the 13th century French dream vision poem Roman de la Rose, and circulated in other medieval works, along with the myriad popular tales of a man loving an image either of Venus or Mary, the result being taking holy vows if the statue was of Mary, or death if it was Venus. As Kenneth Gross puts it, In these stories, quote, certain qualities of the statue begin to take hold of those around it. The living statue turns living persons to stone or brings about their death. A Western storytelling tradition of over 2,000 years, in short, dictates that loving a statue, getting sucked into its frozen stasis, means you are going to die. The third link between love and death in Meyer's story is the ancient notion of love too passionate and perfect to be experienced in mortal life. Fatal passion is more than simply a function of teenage mood swing. It was the basis of the fin amour or courtly love tradition. Oops, I missed one there. That began in the south of France in the 12th century and has deeply impacted Western ideas of romantic love ever since. Provençal trouvères like William of Poitiers expressed their undying love, either unrequited or never consummated, for a high-born lady married to another man in what scholars have called a form of pseudo-sacred worship of the love object as quasi-divinity. In his Love in the Western World, the 20th century French philosopher Denis de Rougemont famously argued that the troubadour's unique take on romantic love was based on the heretical notions of the Cathars, a powerful sect that flourished alongside the troubadours in the 12th century south of France and was wiped out by the army of the Pope. And I would just add in passing that has been fodder for Gothic novels and of the esoteric for the last 200 years. This Manichaean legacy of passionate love that cannot be fulfilled in a mortal lifetime on a flawed earth ruled by Lucifer, de Rougemont insisted, lived on to exert through the troubadour's poetry a massive influence on Western love mores and literature. Many strong echoes of Cathar dualism are present in the Twilight series, from the notion of the perfect realization of love after death, even to the imagery of the novel titles as Bella moves closer to her heart's desire. The Cathar opposition of, quote, terrestrial night, meaning life, to transistent day, meaning death, is oddly echoed in the sequence Twilight, Pale Moon, Eclipse, and the last book, Breaking Dawn, chronicling Bella's death, rebirth, and ascension. In the Twilight series, however, the fin amour roles are reversed, and the human supplicant is female, not male. Bella's elect status after death connects to another set of ancient and pan-cultural story tradition, those around a human loving a god and thereby gaining some form of divinity herself. In the Western tradition before Christianity, there are innumerable stories of the gods of the Greek and Roman pantheon choosing human lovers. When Bella marries her god, however, she doesn't leave the planet. She is translated into a different level of existence right here on Earth after she dies. This outcome taps into still another esoteric religious current of Western culture, if an even more radical one, that appears over and over again in all the subgenres of the New Gothic, that of becoming a god, or at least assuming godlike powers while still on Earth and in one's own body. So back to the story, Bella gets that she has to die if she wants to unite as an equal with her immortal lover. Secretly wanting to have sex as a human so that she can get pregnant, Bella, after much negotiation, agrees to marry Edward first, after which he will make her a vampire. Following a trope that encompasses both sex with the devil and sex with fairies in pre-modern times, and UFO abductees' reports of sex with aliens today, Bella's body is heavily bruised during their violent lovemaking. She does become pregnant during their honeymoon, and following another folk and popular culture trope about the devil's spawn, the baby grows in her womb with alarming and unnatural speed. Edward barely has time to inject Bella with the fatal venom that will make her a vampire as she starts to die, giving birth to their hybrid vampire-human daughter, Renesmee. Bella's transition from life to death to immortality is an epic passage. In effect, she becomes Mary and Christ rolled into one, first birthing her half-human, half-immortal child, which in this case is a girl, then undergoing, just like Jesus, a 3-day harrowing of hell that involves an unbearable sensation of endless, excruciatingly painful burning of her flesh before she emerges in her new vampire identity. And I would just say in passing that her passage might equally be read, Catholic Christian style, as the assumption of Mary to heaven in her intact body. Because when Bella comes to, she finds herself not in Pluto's Hades, nor in the dank subterranean burial vaults holding the coffins of the Gothic undead. Instead, she resurfaces in the ordinary world, which now stands revealed as an earthly paradise thanks to her incredibly heightened vampire senses that allow her to penetrate deep into the life energies of the planet. Quote, "I could see the dust motes in the air. They spun like little planets moving around each other in a celestial dance." When Bella tries calling up the forms of her former cloudy human world, quote, "dim human memories seen through weak eyes and heard through weak ears, it feels," she says, "like trying to squint through muddy water." Another way of saying, in the language of 1 Corinthians, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face." When she observes herself telepathically in her daughter Renesmee's thought images, she sees, quote, "both of my faces, hideous human and glorious immortal." In the same way, Bella's own image in the mirror is flawless. Her body is, quote, "smooth and strong, glistening subtly, luminous as a pearl. Her face perfectly composed, a carving of a goddess." Edward is equally beautiful, and looking at Edward's father is like staring at the sun. These exquisite demigods not only sparkle in the sunlight, all these vampires, they, quote, "smell like cinnamon, hyacinth, pear, seawater, rising bread, vanilla, leather, apple, moss, lavender, chocolate." In a trope that echoes the X-Men graphic novels and movies, each vampire has his own special paranormal gift completely unrelated to vampire traits. Bella's own 2 superpowers surpass them all. She can control the overwhelming thirst for human blood a newly fledged vampire experiences, and she can build protective auric shields around her loved ones. In addition, this former klutz is now stronger than Edward. She runs faster than he can, leaps over rivers, kills a mountain lion. She and the other vampires possess, in a word, the miraculous physical powers of saints or cities, but they stand outside the governing framework of a god or controlling oneness. The vampires answer to no one's law, human and divine, but their own. Finally, in a significant departure from 20th century conventions of hybrid human supernatural offspring, and you might recall Alia the Abomination, the spice-infused mutant child in Frank Herbert's Dune, Bella's half-human, half-vampire daughter, Renesmee, who possesses even greater superpowers than her mother, is represented as a normal child, not as a horror of nature, even though she, like Anne Rice's Acacia, in reality is a kind of female monster god. Stephenie Meyer's Mormon faith has often been noted by reviewers, usually in a faintly scolding reference to conservative social politics vis-a-vis the sexually abstinent for 3 books out of 4 storyline, And here I just have to say, did they not read the fourth novel, you know? But deeper currents of Mormon theology inform her fictional universe, most particularly the doctrine called exaltation, the notion that humans can achieve physical resurrection and Godhead in the afterlife. Like the American spiritualists who came after him and the Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg before him, Joseph Smith subscribed to the notion that angels are humans who evolve into semi-divine beings after death, where they keep their earthly male or female gender and continue having sex, called heavenly marriage, with angels of the same level and communities. But Mormon exaltation means that those who lived righteously in life ascend to the celestial kingdom, the highest degree of glory, where they will live eternally as gods and goddesses, keeping celestial marriage with the mate they had on earth, and capable, unlike Meyer's vampires, of having spirit children. They will also share the full, quote, power, glory, dominion, and knowledge, unquote, possessed by God the Father and Jesus Christ. In the much-quoted words of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints President Lorenzo Snow, as man is, God once was, and as God is, man may be. Bella's vampire change is an apotheosis. Having been granted physical superpowers, an infallible vampire mind with total recall, and above all, immortality, she has become a perfected being. A divine human now, she walks the earth not with the murderous spawn of Cain or Satan, but with the angels, her vampire peers. She has entered the bright, shining company of the immortals, her, quote, true place in the world, the place I fit in, the place I shined. Her heightened senses and perfect sexuality match the conditions both of pre-fall paradise and of Swedenborgian heaven, where celestial sexuality is an exalted alchemical wedding that reunites the world and the two sexes. As part of the larger trend towards normalization of the supernatural happening across many Gothic subgenres in our new century, Meyer has injected strands of esoteric religious thinking into a popular culture genre that reaches a very wide audience of readers and filmgoers around the world. So in conclusion then, what's the big picture? And what I see here is, in the broader framework, is the traditionally dark Gothic, which has been in the sort of Anglo-American pop culture the only vehicle for representing the supernatural outside organized religion, has finally reached a tipping point. Chafing at what in most traditional human cultures would be an unnatural distortion and stigmatization of the world of spirits, which is our cultural heritage from the Protestant Reformation, that the supernatural is exclusively Lucifer's realm. What I like to call the sub-zeitgeist, that is that stew of popular culture and lowbrow everything, responded with a kind of unconscious imperative to transform this dark template into a sunnier, more all-embracing spiritual framework by presenting an array of imaginary immortals and humans with paranormal powers who blend monstrous with good, female with male, and light with dark. The 21st century Gothic offers a weird subliminal corrective pantheon to Protestant Christianity's three male gods of light. And just as an example of some of the religion building, spirituality building that goes in the fan-based groups who take fantasy and science fiction novels and films as a kind of scripture and build a spirituality around it, and there are innumerable examples of this, from Star Trek to Lord of the Rings to many other novels and mainly novels by individual authors. There is now a little new religion around the Twilight series, and it's called Cullinism. Cullinism holds that the Twilight characters are real and should be worshipped as gods. One adherent dubs Edward Cullen, quote, the god of protection, chivalry, and game, Bella, the god of insecurities, closure, and beginnings, Carlyle, the god of health and prosperity, and so on, adding that each of these gods, quote, can be prayed to for different reasons, whether it's because you're part of their house or because they're your favorite Cullen, or perhaps it's because you're in need of their specific guidance. Today, Anglo-American popular culture and the global popular culture it still deeply influences, even though there's a whole other story about how global popular culture is now coming back to influence us, is in the midst of a shift toward an image-based supernaturalism embracing religious consciousness, a shift that is as gradual but ultimately profound as the one our cultural ancestors underwent 400 years ago during the Protestant Reformation. This time, the theological debate is raging in a ruined Gothic castle undergoing serious renovation. The blood-spattered walls have been scrubbed down to receive a fresh coat of white paint as a greasy black bat, born of the Reformation, morphs into a shining, heterodox vampire angel. Thank you.
So we'll open it up to questions, but make sure you use the microphone. Well, since you started with the Emily Dickinson poem, I think it would be safe to say that poem can be read either way, and there's been a lot of controversy, but what would you do? I mean, Dickinson really, in my view, was saying that heaven is earth and we are divine in our mortal beings. I mean, I don't think she thought you had to consume blood by any means, but she just felt that earth was heaven and life was divine and celebrated it in that way and gave it immortal and heavenly resonance. But this is different. I mean, it's not a celebration of, if I'm reading this right, it's not a celebration of life on earth, qua life on earth, that this is all we have, it's fantastic, we better enjoy it because it's over. It will be over. So there's no, for Dickinson, for example, the only future there was, the only immortality you had was the memory that friends had of you, your loved ones, and insofar as you were, your memory was perpetuated, you were immortal, but that's where it ended. So, so that's a very different, that's a kind of secular, very deeply secular view, profoundly different from what you're talking about.
I would say it's not different, but go ahead.
Well, go ahead then, that's my question.
Well, what I see as a common trend here is American transcendentalism. And what Emerson would say about the divine human and the perfected being is very, very close to what is filtered through, you know, over a century and a half into Stephenie Meyer's vampires. Dickinson, yes, she does have like a more diluted and secular form of that notion that the divine is somehow incarnated in the human. I'm not an expert on her as you are, and so if you tell me that she thought everything went, you know, was gone after death and you only had memories, then I'll take that as a fact. But the notion that divinity is somehow embodied in the human is very, very, very central to this tradition of alternative, radical Reformation, alternative spirituality that would blossom with the Transcendentalists but has also manifested in these other different religious traditions that I mentioned.
So they share that. And then my other question, which is really a big one, if just because you've done all this research, so would you say that vampirism, I realize it's got its religious framework and antecedents and so forth, but does it coincide, the popularity of the genre, with moments of capitalist, I'm going to say something like success or productivity or you know, a kind of major difference in financial status, so that some groups are preying on others? I mean, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, it seems to me just that it's an expression of how people, you know, feel preyed upon in some way, or the whole preyed upon motif, or the consuming and consumed, devouring. And that's just fascinating. That why are we so obsessed with it?
You know, it's interesting that you bring that up, Wendy, because I know you've studied the Gilded Age, the 1890s, and there's one scholar who claims that the whole vampire thing peaks in every 100 years, you know, in the 90s or whenever. But that doesn't quite work out if you look at the figures, because Polidori was 1820 and, you know, on and on and on. What I think, the idea of the vampire has been used as a metaphor since it first came into Western European culture. Voltaire used vampirism as a metaphor for power, you know, people who sought power over other people, and politicians and so on. Since then, it has served as a metaphor for almost everything you can imagine, right up to AIDS, excluded minorities, et cetera, et cetera. What I find interesting is the shift from the bad to the good, in the sense that True Blood, you know, the vampires are kind of a disenfranchised minority that are actively seeking their rights from the government, and so on and so on. That said, the vampire kind of template through up to Stephenie Meyer was really one of power and dominance. And the vampire in the 90s particularly, there was a great flourishing of a vampire subculture, which Anne Rice likes to claim that she started the whole goth movement with her novels, and that she also started you know, this whole vampire subculture lifestyle. There are people out there, they were particularly in the 90s, but still today, who do drink, draw other people's blood, who get prosthetic fangs. You know, there was quite a run on those for a long time, and who do the whole vampire thing. There's a vampire religion, the Temple of the Vampire. You can see it online. And the dominant, well, to repeat the adjective, the dominant strain of those kinds of the vampire subculture of those days was dominance, control and dominance. That was really the motif. What's interesting in the last 10 years, and that's why I really like to talk about the 21st century Gothic, is that the formerly bad things are being rethought and reconfigured. So you have these ethical vampires, and they aren't into power and dominance. They're very egalitarian. They have a family everyone would love to have. They're, you know, they settle things by discussion. They don't, nobody's, you know, a tyrant or overseer. So I see these older forms and conventions being twisted into more positive figures. And for me, the overarching reason for this is simply because the Gothic and anything supernatural has really been relegated in our culture to lowbrow literature and film. It's not, you know, we have this funny culture that's full of America, that's full of great awakenings and great religious fervor on one hand, and a almost entirely secular mainstream elite intellectual culture that just has no truck with any of that stuff. So there's this polarization there. Meanwhile, in the sort of sub-zeitgeist, people who crave spirituality and who aren't particularly drawn to organized religion find the only kind of supernatural representation in these kinds of dark horror stories. And after a while, you kind of want the sunlight in. And so I see this as a very natural progression, that they use the vocabulary and the characters they've been given, these, creepy monsters and everything, and the monster, make the monster into something a little more palatable and a little more interesting. So I guess that's my answer.
Hi, I'm a big fan. But I have a question that actually picks up on something Wendy said. I actually work on the Protestant Reformation. And what I was wondering is if we might actually see that long streak of, which I think is what you've been referring to, kind of the notion of perfectibility and sanctification on earth, which comes straight out of Puritanism and keeps going. And along, in the 20th century, that was attached to some idea of the progress of capitalism, that part of this, the good works. And I do wonder if that one is actually drawn towards seeing the family that you describe, and even the part that, the people spend far too much time on, the true love waits aspect of this, as forms of good works. I mean, they actually do good deeds. And this is part of, they're being saved by doing good. They're not being saved by grace, which is the place where perfectibility and sanctification was always under criticism by other Protestant observers.
Very interesting.
So, so, and in the 20th century, a very, secular, an age of secular theory, part of that got turned into, well, obviously Puritans must have thought if they worked hard and they would make a lot of money, and that was a sign of God's favor. And that's not really particularly true of Puritans, but it certainly was true of the 20th century. So that's actually two different points, but I think that's very intriguing. And I was thinking, as you said that Carlisle Cullen is an emergency room doctor. He doesn't have to be because he has all this money. But at the same time, there's a slightly uncomfortable emphasis on their wealth, in the sense that Edward drives a Ferrari and he's been to Harvard twice. It's just this sense of elitism, the elitism gets carried through in that, in a way that maybe it isn't in some of the others, like True Blood. And of course, I totally skipped over Buffy, the Vampire Slayer. If anyone wants to talk about Buffy, we can, but I won't. But I'm just thinking that, I'm not as familiar with these books, but it must be really hard what a good work it must be to struggle against your own bloodlust and work in an emergency room, right? So, like and that would be the Puritan version, that would be conquering the flesh, right? So
it's conquering, yes, beautiful. It's conquering the flesh, exactly.
But I'll let someone else ask you about Buffy.
Yeah. There's a couple here.
So I wanted to also build on Professor Martin's point about, it seems that you're suggesting that there's a transition in Meyer's work from active vampirism to passive vampirism, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on, I guess, I don't remember the director's name, but the film Let the Right One In, and then the American adaptation of that film,
right.
Asians, and whether cultural distinction kind of factors into your work, and whether your thesis applies globally, like locally to America, to Europe, where does it kind of stop? Because the representations of vampires in both those films, at least in my view, is very different. So I was wondering if...
Yeah, it does morph and change when it gets out of the Anglo-American context, which is the mainstream Gothic. It started in England, and then it obviously spread elsewhere. And of course, Hammer films in the 50s, the English Hammer films, were very important in furthering the vampire image. Let the Right One In, which I lashed myself 100 strokes for accidentally calling a Danish film instead of a Swedish film,
in the book, is an interesting story, and I would just add also, I couldn't just tell you off the top of my head how I thought it differs. I think it's still very much in the European and therefore Western culture mainstream. What's really interesting is when you get to how this plays out in Japan and also other Asian literature, manga, film, and so on, because the figure of the vampire more sort of conflates with the demon in Japanese folklore. And so you get this, there's this one called Blood. Does anyone know Blood, the female vampire? It's a fascinating story. She's Japanese, and the main story is set when she's asked to find, she's a vampire, and she's asked to find vampires at an American army base during the Vietnam War. Someone could write a really great deconstruction of that story. But the real heart of the Blood story is that she has a confrontation with her mother. And the language and the subtitles, it alternates between vampire and demon. But she finally, at the end, she has to kill her mother. And as her mother is dying, she says, "Now you're no better than I am." One of the interesting things that Asian horror introduced into the Western horror tradition is the idea of the active female monster. Because for the most part, in the Anglo-American Gothic tradition, if you had a female ghost, it was like a woman in white, who flitted through the house, the old Gothic house or whatever. Not one of these really heart-stopping, badass female out-to-get-you characters that come from the Asian tradition, and that now, of course, in the last 10 years, have filtered. There's this whole, it went to Asia and then it came back to Hollywood. And so what you have now is really much more of a mix of global influence than the, I won't even say pure, but the original Anglo-American tradition.
Can I just ask one follow-up question?
Yeah.
Because it seems like you're suggesting that Meyer's film sort of ends the vampire tradition with like the idea of a good vampire. And there's a book that I've read. I actually worked with a professor. It's called Metamorphoses of the Vampire, and he kind of looks at the history of vampirism through a Foucauldian lens, but also implicitly critical of Foucault for suggesting that there is such like idealization of man as a category that could ever kind of vanish, or the idea that like humanity itself kind of always needs the exception, like the monstrous is kind of like the view in that text, except it stops at 1930. So like you obviously surpass that. So I'm wondering, like, what happens? Like, is there a new category of vampire because of this film, or because of this series of texts, or is it that Meyer actually ended like the idea of vampirism itself? Like, is it like now sublimated into culture?
Yeah, no, I don't think she's ended it at all. And I would also add that there's still a large tributary of dark, evil vampires that carry right through. But I don't know if you're familiar with Justin Cronin's novel, The Passage. Has anyone read The Passage? And interestingly enough, vampirism kind of morphs with the vampire and the zombie morph to a certain degree. And these vampires are created by an escaped virus, but there's also an elaborate kind of pantheon of, and this one little girl turns out to be the chosen one who will, live 1,000 years or?
And save this.
And save everyone else.
People.
Yeah.
It's a bit like Lyra in the Pullman series.
Yes, yeah. So it's like, she's the, again, the vampire as the human who undergoes apotheosis to fulfill a messianic really a messianic role, and typically and interestingly, it's the female who does this.
Did you read his interview yesterday in the New York Times?
No, I missed that.
He was interviewed in a Sunday book review, and his daughter asked for a novel with a girl at the center of it. He had not written in this style before. He written these kind of small domestic dramas, and so he's as amazed as anyone that he's making billions of dollars off this. I'm sorry. Billions of dollars off this. But the thing that I thought was particularly interesting was that he is strongly protesting he considers himself a high-level writer. This is not pulp fiction. And he's demanding his due as being taken seriously, which actually gets back to what you were saying about the zeitgeist, the
sub-zeitgeist.
The sub-geist. I was like the occult zeitgeist.
Yeah.
So, that was interesting that he is stressing both the kind of domestic origins of this, putting a girl at the center and doing something sort of transcendent, and that he does not want to be considered with, Charlene Harris or, Stephenie Meyer.
I'm sorry, that's an English professor protecting his rear end. I just have to say, I don't buy that for a second. And he's right up there as a pulp fiction writer.
It's a very pulpy book.
It's pulpy like crazy. What's he thinking? But for me, the interesting thing is the overlap, and this is a new creature that I like to call either the Zampire or the Zombie. That. Has the sort of, it's like a whole clutch of vampires who are somewhat mindless and kind of take over other people one way or another. I would also just add, as I talk about in the book, that the zombie fiction is also undergoing this morphing, and there are now zombies who get redeemed through love and start to reverse their zombie process. And this is in, oh my God, I can't think of his name right now. What's his name? Oh dear, I talk about it. This is middle-aged memory at work, but it's in the zombie chapter in the book. But at any rate, this young zombie eats the brains of a young man, and because of doing that, he absorbs all the memories this kid has of his girlfriend. And he falls in love with the girlfriend because he's absorbed the memories of the guy whose brains he's eaten, kidnaps her off to the zombie land, which is the airport, and he has this 747, and he plays her Frank Sinatra records. And anyway, long story short, they're afraid to kiss, just like Edward and Bella, because he's afraid he'll start to eat her brains, or he'll make her a zombie or whatever. But when they finally kiss, there's this amazing, and by this time he's starting to not be rotting anymore. He's going back in the other direction. And when they kiss, there's this amazing transcendental moment, and both their eyes turn yellow, and they both immediately assume superpowers of more of a perfected being type powers together. And so the end of that story suggests that they're going to go off and start, a new race. So this particular story is kind of spread across a lot of different genres. There's a lot of crossover. Oops.
Hi, my question is about Meyer, but I'm going to get there through Star Wars. So when I originally saw Star Wars, and I heard that he drew a lot of, Lucas drew a lot of his kind of content, or at least his strategies, from Joseph Campbell and Joseph Campbell's conception of the story of the hero and all sorts of mythologies from around the world. I had the sensation that there was a kind of manipulation going on the part of George Lucas, as if he was learning, for instance, from Joseph Campbell how to manipulate people in a sense. And to a certain extent, when I was writing about this on the forum last night, I realized that, writing is to a large extent, movies and literature, just manipulation on its own. But again, I can't escape the feeling that, for instance, Meyer in particular, and also maybe romance writers in general, are engaging in a much more explicit act of manipulating, for instance, kind of the desires of their audience, the wish fulfillment of their audience, more so than other forms of literature. And I was wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Manipulation in that context is sometimes called formulaic writing, that in other words, instead of, something deeply original where the characters follow something perhaps more resembling real life ups and downs and detours and so on, that it's a formula, a very set formula, both romance and horror, murder mysteries, all of those kinds of fiction that have a very set structure in which certain things have to happen, at certain times. So I guess I'm myself feel, I tend to be a bit of a defender of these forms in the sense that I also hear an awful lot of flack from my literary colleagues who really wanted me in this book to give some literary evaluation, and by that they meant to say that it was really crap, And I always fall back on the writer that I do quote in Gothicka, G.K. Chesterton, the English essayist, who wrote a beautiful essay called In Defense of the Penny Dreadful. And he was saying that all these stories that boys love to read, these very formulaic stories that everyone turns their nose up at, address a primal storytelling need in us. And I think, and that there's a kind of satisfaction that comes out of, just as in fairy tales, I think you would have to say that fairy tales manipulate in that same way because they follow a very set structure. So I guess what I hear you saying is that you think it's a bad, by use of the word manipulation, you think it's a bad thing. So maybe tell me what you mean by that.
Well, right, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm conflicted about, I mean, I love Star Wars, but at the same time, I feel like there is, I mean, I'll just speak about Meyer, but especially in the sense that if we're talking about her audience being largely teenage girls in their early teens, I mean, just looking at the audience itself, it sounds like she's going for people who are, it doesn't have to be girls, but that age range that are very kind of susceptible exactly to those kinds of influences. And they're the same influences that are being thrown at them by the media, and the Disney Channel is raising, girls to be sexualized by the time they're like 12 or 11. They're already, acting like they're 18 and are in college. And whether this is, I guess what disturbs me about it is that this seems like a kind of very kind of bizarre perpetuation of that kind of trend. And I wonder if you think it has any kind of negative societal impacts.
Well, I guess the whole question is really whether women's romance as a genre, which is actually a descendant of the Gothic in very interesting ways, is something that gives us a false idea of life, and therefore is something that we should forswear. I don't know. What do you guys think? Anybody have an opinion or a agreement or defense of the genre?
I'll be happy to defend it. I'm talking up.
I was just gonna say I'm the one that wants to talk about Buffy.
Okay.
But if you do examine the two kind of from the point of the heroine, Buffy versus Bella is definitely a slide down in the personal empowerment of women and young girls. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I kind of see what you're getting at. Bella has been really criticized because she gives up her chance to go to college and she just totally dedicates herself to Edward, and that's a very old-fashioned kind of ideal, whereas Buffy is this kick-ass martial artist. And I just want to tell you that Buffy, who was created by Joss Whedon and very much came out of the Japanese martial arts manga tradition, in which many male artists created these babes, these martial art babes, you know, who in scanty costumes, who could really kick the fellows around. And so, so Buffy actually came out of a male tradition of sci-fi, whatever you want to call it. And Bella comes much more from the older women's romance tradition. What happened in the 90s was really interesting, though, and that Buffy was part of that phenomenon. And that was the hybridization of all these different Gothic subgenres. And all of a sudden, women's romance became part detective story, part noir, part sci-fi, the whole new subgenre of paranormal romance, which is what Twilight really belongs to, was created. And the same went for a lot of the other, you know, all of the different kind of pulp genres started interbreeding with each other and producing these strange hybrids, hybrid genres. I guess my own feeling, if you're interested in my own feeling, it is that when I was a teenager, a very young teenager, I just swooned over Jane Eyre. And I see a lot of Jane Eyre in Bella, and when you look at it closely, she's not quite as passive as she looks, because as she tells Edward, she doesn't want to be Lois Lane, she wants to be Superman too. And she ends up being way more kick-ass than Buffy. I mean, she would shred Buffy if they met face to face with her new superpowers by the end of book 4. But it's a long time getting there. And bearing in mind also, one of the things that happened to women's romance is that it then became extremely eroticized. There's a whole subgenre of women's romance that's the erotic women's romance. And if you go to websites like Alora's Cave, which started in the early 2000s, you can get, and it's all done by category of sexuality and also intensity of sexuality. Like on a scale of 10, you can get exactly the level of eroticism you want in your romance. And this is in a genre that up to about 1980, the most that ever happened was a kiss. Right? Anyone who was around in those days. The kiss was the big moment in the very chaste women's romance up to the late 20th century. So there was this complete flip into, honestly, hardcore eroticism, very wide, it's a very, very popular subgenre. So viewed in that context, I don't know, the Twilight series seems pretty innocent to me. Yeah. Oh wait, you've had your hand up, so let her talk first.
You made a comment a little bit ago that the villainous male had transformed into kind of the demonic female. I wondered, you kind of left out the next progression, the monstrous child. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about the monstrous child, because Bella and Edward's daughter is definitely turned into the monstrous child. And that kind of in opposition to the messianic child, or the child who saves everything.
Well, in the case of Renesmee, the monster child is the messianic child. And even the series stops there, but the implication is that she is the one who has the greatest powers of them all. And there's no indication that she's going to be using them for evil. And the same thing with the Justin Cronin novel, the young girl who is now she is a monster child. She's not born of, she's not a hybrid the way Renesmee is, but she's definitely a vampire. But she's also going to be this savior for 1,000 years. So what I see happening to the monstrous child is the monstrous child becomes the messianic child.
Then is this just a capitalistic tool to ensure that you've got another generation of novels?
Well, the marketing, you know, is certainly a subcurrent of all of this, but you know, I don't think any marketer sitting down to try to figure out what's coming next would have ever imagined that this particular turn in the road was going to be taken. It's very complex because pop culture is not the same as folklore. You know, folklore traditions get carried on, fairy tales, ballads, so on. There's a certain amount of romanticizing of folk oral traditions. Pop culture trends and traditions tend to change almost, but not quite, in the same way that folklore stories change as they pass down. In pop culture, how it differs from high culture is the notion that originality is not really what you're looking for. What you're looking for is the formula, that form that's so satisfying, and you want to riff on it, you want to change it a little bit. For instance, the first person who thought of, in the movie car chases, to have a car going the wrong way on the freeway, I'd give anything to know what the first one of those was, because then immediately everybody else, whenever they had a car chase, it was always the car going the wrong way on the freeway, because it's a great idea. So there are all these ideas that get picked up. I mean, Meyer took the statue thing from Anne Rice, and it's also in White Wolf, the Masquerade, the video game. The vampires look like statues. So there are all of these story elements and characteristics that get carried along. The idea of putting vampires and werewolves together really came from Tanya Huff, the Canadian vampire writer, and it was a very clever idea because the vampires are so cold. I mean, who really thinks that a statue is erotic or appealing? So you need the exact opposite, you know, this primal animal, you know, energy. It's, you know, Dionysian and Apollonian, for heaven's sakes. So Meyer picked up on that. So there's all these borrowings going on. And these writers are always getting sued for plagiarism, and it's absolutely pointless because that's really not, plagiarism is not what it's about. It's about borrowing and developing stories. So I don't know if that answers your question about Monster Child. Do you have an other thing you wanted to say?
My question is, how did you ever come to this research process? I mean, what sparked the interest, and where did you go with it in terms of research?
Well, I always loved ghost stories, and so for me it was an easy entree. Although I just have to say that vampires and zombies are not my personal favorite thing, and zombies in particular make me very anxious, and I can barely watch The Walking Dead without leaving the room. But for me, it was a natural continuation of my book, The Secret Life of Puppets, because that really stopped on a dime in 1999, and I just began. There were implications of this change going, this really, I think, substantial change in terms of the pervasiveness of the supernatural in our culture in a way that could not have been imagined earlier in the 20th century. I remember as a kid reading Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys mysteries, and one of the most shocking facts that I discovered in my research was that by 1979, there were werewolves in the Hardy Boys stories. And it's like shocking, 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 because that just would have been completely unacceptable for children's literature. It was really the 60s that changed everything, because Star Wars and Star Trek really mainstreamed science fiction. And after that came the mainstreaming of fantasy, the mainstreaming of horror. I mean, horror movies were things you could only see in the drive-in. And now all of those are front and center. It also came along with CGI, the less expensive CGI effects, so that you could create fantasy worlds in a very convincing way on the big, a non-cheesy way on the big screen. So that's certainly part of that too. Yeah.
And I just thought of an interesting parallel to what you were saying about the Hardy Boys. I have kids, and sometimes I watch Scooby-Doo with them. And when I was a kid, Scooby-Doo, at the end, it always revealed that there was no real magic. It was just somebody in disguise. But now the Scooby-Doo episodes, there are real witches and there are real monsters, and so it's interesting.
That's big. That's a very significant.
But my question is that I'm interested in what you talk about in both books about the two kind of ways of looking at the world, the episteme and the gnosis, and how it seems that the sub-zeitgeist is a kind of way of the gnosis coming through. For those who don't literally see, the vampire stories as kind of like a religion, or
Right. Yeah.
are you saying that it somehow fulfills we're getting the same kind of satisfaction from it that people who do worship get from their religion, or is it a repressed kind of need?
I would say it's way more repressed. It's a kind of repressed and unconscious hit of weird spirituality, as opposed to organized religion and so on. And but I think what I see in Gothicka, I did make a prediction. I said I felt that there would be a new world religion would eventually evolve out of these weird fan-based scriptural spiritual groups. And boy, have I taken some flack for that. But I think part of the problem, and this ties into your whole transdisciplinary program, is that my book is really a hybrid of literary, culture, history, and religious studies. And most of my reviewers are not in religious studies. So when you say world religion, that really means a religion that has an international base. For instance, Scientology is now considered to be a world religion, and it's in the religion textbooks as such, because it has a sufficient international base, although actually there's been some talk recently that perhaps their statistics are inflated, but whatever. Anyway, so when I say world religion, I just mean one that would be international in some manner or form, not that it was going to take over the world, because one of the things in this whole trying to put this business of episteme on one side, very simplistically speaking, kind of rational, materialist, scientific ways of finding knowledge and truth, and gnosis, which is the more intuitive, transcendental way of knowing that also allows for non-material dimensions of reality along with the material world. That I do see I see them kind of leveling out, and I find it very exciting, because I think the most exciting periods in world culture have been those where both of those ways of knowing have been valued in one way or another, and one has not been dominating over the other. I mean, in the Middle Ages, European Middle Ages, it was all gnosis, you get burned at the stake if you do scientific research. But in the last 300 years, since what used to be called the Enlightenment, it's now the other way around, and you don't get burned at the stake, luckily, but people get very, very uncomfortable in high intellectual culture if you start talking about these things.
I was just wondering about another, well, the first thing in the comment, of course, is, L. Ron Hubbard wrote science fiction. So you might also be able to trace where certain literary forms become a form of religion. And in thinking about that, the age of Star Trek is also tracked very nicely, and I think you handle it in Gothicka a bit, by the rise of the apocalyptic Christian novel or book like The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, which eventually becomes, I think, a basis for a whole stream of thought that turns into the Left Behind series, and that so there's a kind of Christian apocalypticism that has also, I think, been feeding maybe off of just space exploration or the 1960s or just massive change, but. That's another strand. I think it gives rise to the apocalyptic child as well as the destruction of the world in the zombie scenario, especially. But I think all of this, and I realize that there's a whole strand of people, most of them in my own background because it's where I come from, and that would be people who would never read a lot of these kind of novels because they're bad or they're dirty or they're trashy, but who sit around and read the Left Behind series, which is extraordinarily bloodthirsty in its own way. Right. And things like The Late Great Planet Earth, where people's enemies are finally vanquished by the good in ghastly, bloody, horrifying ways, because it's right out of the Book of Revelation. So, which is possibly the scariest novel ever written. So.
And Elaine Pagels has just written a very nice book on interpretations of the Book of Revelation. Yeah, are you guys familiar with the Left Behind series, those 12 volumes? Those are a quintessentially late 20th century sort of into the Bush era form of kind of Christian imperialism almost. But they also have roots, and of course, here I'm just blanking out again. A scholar friend told me very definitively there are two 70s sci-fi novels, not The Late Great Planet Earth, but something else. It will come to me at 2 a.m. this morning, and I'll remember, but I'm blanking out on them right now. But you can go back to Stephen King's The Stand if you want to also see a kind of apocalyptic quasi-Christian novel in which good and evil are embodied in a 101-year-old African-American woman and a sleazeball cowboy, again, I've not forgotten his name, but at any rate, so there were all these, the 20th century had all these apocalyptic standoffs. But now we're in the 21st century. This is post-apocalyptic, and this is one reason why you have all these post-apocalyptic stories. We got the apocalypse, 1999, whatever, and now we're sort of mentally have gone on to what happens after the apocalypse. One of the most interesting Christian artifacts to me that I talk about in Gothicka is William P. Young's The Shack. Is anyone here familiar with that novel? It's an allegorical, not Gothic novel, basically about a man whose daughter is murdered in a particularly terrible way in a national park, and he loses his faith, and finally he gets a note telling him he should go to this place where they never found her body, but her bloodstains are. And so he goes to this wretched, horrible, broken down shack, and to his astonishment finds that it's this beautiful log cabin, and it's inhabited by God, who is a middle-aged African-American woman, Jesus Christ, who is a Middle Eastern carpenter who's not particularly good looking, and the Holy Spirit, who is an Asian waif, sort of whatever. And it's just this wonder, it's like a medieval allegory, and it's quite beautifully written. It's totally heretical. All the conservative Christian sort of patriarchs came down on it like a ton of bricks, but all the other conservative Christians have thrown away their Left Behind books, and they're reading The Shack like crazy. They love it because it's actually a very beautifully written, sophisticated religious allegory. So I do feel that our new century has a very different tone value in all of this stuff than the preceding one. And I don't know, I just think it's very exciting to see what's the next thing is going to be. Did you have another?
I can kind of go off that. I am intrigued by this concept of the shift from the bad to the good.
Mm-hmm.
I can see the evolution of the vampire in literature. But I guess my question is, I see the Cullens as more of an anomaly, and so how do the Volturi fit into what you're saying, and do they apply to your thesis, and do they fit into the progression that you write about?
Well, there's always going to be bad folks. What can I say? You know, and just like there are bad humans, there are always going to be bad vampires. And in any kind of story of this sort, as G.K. Chesterton would tell you, there has to be a good guy and a bad guy. So it's all, now that it's kind of all vampires, then there are going to be good vampires and they're going to be bad vampires. I mean, that's how it would be. Now, in terms of being an anomaly, again, there you have all these other evil vampires going on, but what really strikes me in all the different TV series, like the Vampire Diaries, you know, and these kinds of shows, is it's this normalization thing. The vampires walk amongst us. You know, they go to high school just like we do, and drive cars and are visible, and they don't turn to dust in the daylight. This whole thing that Alan Ball mentioned that was so intriguing to me, he said they were part of deep nature. The supernatural was part of deep nature, and that meant that it functioned around us in the ordinary world, just like anything else.
Thank you very much for a very wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.